Good afternoon. I got Zig Rubel with Fast Plan. Zig, tell us a little bit about your journey and where you came from.
Sure. Thanks, KP. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say I was from Brooklyn, New York, but I grew up on the East Coast. And the interesting thing about growing up in New York City as an architect, which I started out as, is that you don't get to build a lot of new buildings in New York because so much of the built environment is there already. So I had an opportunity to work on Sprint's corporate headquarters in Overland Park, Kansas, and spent 2.5 years out there, basically designing and overseeing the construction on a 4 million square foot campus. And it was an incredible experience. And I really learned how collaboration and working as a team could really make things happen. And then I landed a job in San Francisco at a company called entrepreneurial Architects. Was there for about 10 years, working and leading large healthcare projects. So when I was hired, I told my then former boss that I really didn't want to work on a large project because I just came from a 4 million square foot project. And he said, "Oh, this is only 1 million square feet. It's not that big, but in many ways, 1 million square foot hospital project is a lot more complicated than a 4 million square foot corporate park." So while I was at Anston Allen, I ran into a entrepreneur who wanted to start a company using technology from the space that he was in, which is integrated circuits, and was intrigued with the idea. As a building architect, we talk about design automation, but I was never exposed to anything like the design automation in integrated circuitry. So I was really curious about it, and much to maybe the dismay of my wife, who I'm still married to, decided to start a company with him. And I was one of the co-founders at a company called Aditas. And the idea was to take the technology from the integrated circuit industry and apply it to healthcare buildings. That was kind of our beachhead, and was there for about 8 years. And we got to develop some really good software. Ultimately, I would say the reason why we weren't as successful as we wanted to be is we just didn't focus on the problem. And the problem that we had identified was that there was a lot of variation and customized solutions in the healthcare space. And ideally, things took just way too long to both figure out what was needed and the design that was eventually developed. So after I left, I got to finish up the designs as a design architect, and realized that being a design architect is almost as difficult as being an entrepreneur. And one of the things that we were trying to sell was this approach to figure out what I would call the planning requirements, or figure out what building a client would want or need for their healthcare project. And almost everyone we spoke with said, "Yeah, we really like this, but we don't want to hire you to do it. We want to, we'd rather have the architects or the consultants that we work with to use a tool like this." So about 1.5 years ago, we made a pivot, and that's where Forsight Digital really got its birth. And the idea was to take the tool that we developed in-house and used in-house to determine the healthcare facility requirements for buildings to make it more usable for anyone. And I'm kind of transitioning to my current company. So the goal of our current company is to help project teams, whether it's the owner being the operator, or the clinicians, the architects or consultants, or the builders, figure out what requirements they might need when designing a healthcare building. And in particular, in the many projects that I've worked on in healthcare, I noticed that the projects take as long or longer to figure out what a project needs as it takes to design and build it. And in some cases, it even takes longer. So the first project that I worked on when I came out to the Bay Area was a project where the healthcare operator spent over a decade figuring out what kind of hospital project that they wanted. And what I mean by that is that the client first wanted what I would call a traditional hospital, where it had over 500 beds and a large doctor's office building and a diagnostic and treatment center. And the client then saw that the market was shifting, and they really didn't need as many beds to build there, and that maybe they could leverage the existing ecosystem of beds in the South Bay. And they directed the firm at the time to redesign it to what they called a bedless hospital. And they got to the point where the architect was about to resubmit the drawings to the state, and they said, no, we have to add the beds back in. So I tell everyone that I got to redesign and build the bedded bedless hospital scheme. So that kind of led the impetus of this idea of what I call requirements planning, and helping clients figure out what is it that they need. Because every healthcare project that I've worked on, we're remodeling it before it's even open. And I don't want to say it's anyone's fault, but I think the problem that exists is that there really isn't a tool to simulate, if that's the right word, how is the building going to perform before you actually open it up. And there are clients that do simulation, let's call it real life simulation of operating a facility beforehand. Sometimes they do it early in the design with cardboard mock-ups. Sometimes they do it late in the design after it's already built and they're trying to figure out staffing. And the problem that we're really focusing on is that early study of operations of a facility for a healthcare building. And the reason why it's so important is one client said to me that everyone focuses on the golf ball, but you really need to worry about the basketball. And what he was referring to is that the golf ball is the design and construction cost. So let's say a golf ball costs $100. Maybe it's a Titleist. I don't play golf, so I may be screwing up the brands. But everyone's focused on reducing that cost of the golf ball from $100 maybe to $90. But the basketball, which may be $1,000, is where all the costs are, because staffing is a huge part of what a healthcare facility needs, and that costs a lot of money, and the built environment influences that. So what Forsight Digital and FastPlan, our first tool, is focusing on is allowing for that operational insight to the building of how it will perform before the design starts. So I probably talked way too much, so I'm sorry, KP.
When you talk about requirement, I don't think that means something to you. Give me an example of what happens when, like, what is a requirement and what is it when, what happens when requirements get wrong? Like, I think that's a kind of a broad term, but I think, you know, if I'm a patient, why do I care?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, so when I say requirements, specifically, I mean a list of rooms within the building. So, kind of getting down maybe one or two levels. When someone designs a hospital, they first have to figure out what departments that go into it. So, again, if you're a patient, and let's say you go to the emergency room, you're going to want an emergency department. But in an emergency department, they may need a imaging department next to it because the patient may need an X-ray or a CT or an MRI, or the patient may need lab work. So that they'll need a clinical lab next to it and all the different aspects that are in a clinical lab. And they're likely going to need a pharmacy. And if something, let's say, really not so good happened to them, they might need a surgery department. And if they need maybe any of those, they may need to stay in the hospital in a patient bed. So all of those different departments have very unique and specific needs. And what ends up happening is that on every project, even if the client has standards, because there's a lot of clients that are very sophisticated and they have a lot of standards, they end up revalidating and customizing those standards on every project. And that process just takes a really long time. So if you were the patient, to your question, KP, you would want to make sure that if you went in that emergency department, you had access to all of those different services, and that it wouldn't take that long to get those services to you, so that you're comfortable, you're not quote unquote waiting. And some of the work that we did before we started Forsight Digital was actually reducing that wait time, because the client wanted to make sure that their patients were seen right away, and more importantly, they were discharged right away. So we started looking at ways to reduce their stay within the emergency room. And one of the things that we did was created a quick triage area where the patient wouldn't actually even go in the ER. They would be seen by a doctor and nurse. And these were for the less critical patients, not the proverbial gunshot victim wound, but someone who may have sprained or twisted an arm, or maybe had a really bad cold, something that could be quickly evaluated and treated and then dealt with, so that the patient would go home. So the goal is really to help the facility get to where they want to operate before the design actually begins.
So as it relates to kind of patient outcomes,
Right.
the idea is that if I walk into a hospital and I'm waiting around, there could be a staffing problem, but it could also be that the facility, the facility wasn't designed and the resources aren't allocated in the right spots. What happens over time? Like, how does that, for example, with COVID, where things, everything was tested, what happens when, it doesn't seem like a building is a one time and we're done. There's a constant shifting and renovations and shifting of what the needs are. How is that being handled today?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And let me try and answer it in two parts, because COVID was just such an anomaly for the healthcare space. But when you think about it, a healthcare building may, ideally last 50 or 70 years, but the technology that goes into it may change every 2 to 5 years. And in particular, a X-ray or MRI machine, they need to get replaced. And sometimes those technologies really have significant impacts. So if you, so an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging machine is based on the size of the magnet in Teslas. And it's common, when I first started practicing, to have a partial Tesla magnet. And now many healthcare facilities have 3 or 5 Tesla magnets. And what that means from a facility design standpoint is they generate a lot more heat. So they need more, they require a lot more power. So they generate a lot more heat. So there's a lot more HVAC requirements. They vibrate a lot. And all of that affects the building design. So one of the things that we're trying to do is help owners understand how some of those decisions impact their facility need before they actually start designing it, and then finding out those questions. As it relates to COVID, COVID was kind of a big kind of, I don't want to call it train that derailed, but as you were kind of alluding to, KP, hospitals are designed naturally to flex. So for example, one of the scenarios might be there's a really bad school bus accident and what they call mass casualty drills, where maybe 50 people at once would come to the hospital and they could triage that. What COVID did was they were having mass casualty drills every day. So it really inundated the hospital building, and it really caused them to think about prioritization of patients and who got a bed, who didn't get a bed. And it really caused the operators to layer their decision making on who had a right for healthcare, and it was really unfortunate. So if they were able to use a tool like FastPlan, they would be able to see how they could deploy resources, maybe not in the hospital, but outside of the hospital, to treat other disease burdens, like, for example, cardiology, and maybe even cancers, where you don't have to come to the hospital, but you can get treated. And one of the things a lot of us don't know in what happened with COVID is a lot of people didn't get care during the pandemic because they were just afraid to go to the hospital, understandably so. So we really don't know, excuse me, what happened to all of those people that had cardiac pain or cancers. Did they survive? Did they not? All of that is yet to be known. So the benefit of using a tool like FastPlan is that you could actually simulate things like that and really understand it, and ideally come up with a way to solve the situation for that. So I think that answered your question, but I'm not sure.
Great. Thanks, Zig. It was great talking to you today, and best of luck.
Thanks.